The crossbow bolt punched through Kieran Jamison's shoulder with a wet thud that stole his breath before the pain arrived, and he stumbled sideways into the muddy ravine, just as a second volley whistled past where his head had been moments before. His vision blurred as boots thundered from both directions along the forest path, the bandit trap springing shut exactly as they had planned it, and he knew with cold certainty that he was about to die here in this nameless stretch of wilderness, 3 days from any settlement that would care. The world tilted as his legs gave out, blood already soaking through his leather armor in warm pulses that matched his racing heartbeat, and somewhere through the ringing in his ears, he heard rough laughter and the clash of steel being drawn from scabbards. Kieran had survived 4 years as a caravan guard through the frontier territories by trusting his instincts, but his instincts had failed him today. The merchant whose goods he had been protecting lay dead 50 yards back on the trail, an arrow through his throat before he could even cry out. The other 2 guards had scattered when the first volley came, disappearing into the forest like smoke, and Kieran did not blame them. 6 against 3 were bad odds. 6 against 1 were no odds at all. He tried to push himself up from the mud, his right arm refusing to cooperate, the crossbow bolt jutting obscenely from his shoulder. Blood ran down his arm in rivulets, dripping from his fingertips into the standing water. Above him on the trail, shadows moved between the trees. He could hear them calling to each other, coordinating their descent into the ravine where he had fallen. They would take his weapons, his armor, his boots, anything worth selling. Then they would cut his throat and leave him for the crows. Kieran fumbled for the short sword at his belt with his left hand, knowing it would make no difference but unwilling to go down without trying. His fingers closed around the grip just as a figure crashed through the underbrush 10 feet away, and he raised the blade with a snarl that came out more like a wheeze. The figure froze. It was not one of the bandits. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, her powerful frame clad in patched leather and rough spun cloth that had seen better seasons. Green skin, the color of spring moss, caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy, and her dark hair hung in a thick braid over one broad shoulder. Tusks, small but unmistakable, curved up from her lower jaw, and her amber eyes went wide as they locked onto him. For a moment neither of them moved, human and orc regarding each other with equal surprise across the few feet of muddy ground. Then voices called out above them, closer now, and her gaze snapped to the trail before returning to him with an expression he could not read. Kieran tightened his grip on his sword, though his arm was already shaking. "Get out of here," he managed through gritted teeth. "Not your fight." The orc woman did not move. Her eyes traveled from his face to the bolt in his shoulder, to the blood soaking his entire right side, then back to his face. Something shifted in her expression, a decision being made in the span of a heartbeat. She crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, and before Kieran could react she had knocked the sword from his weakened grip and hoisted him over her shoulder like a sack of grain. The world spun violently, and pain exploded through his body in a white-hot wave that made him cry out despite himself. "Quiet," she hissed, already moving. "Unless you want them to find us both." Kieran wanted to protest, wanted to tell her to put him down, wanted to know what in all the hells an orc was doing in these woods, and why she had not simply left him to his fate. But consciousness was slipping away from him like water through his fingers, and all he could do was hang limply over her shoulder as she began to run. The forest blurred around him in shades of green and brown. He caught glimpses of the ground moving beneath them at an impossible speed, felt branches catch at his dangling arm, heard shouts of alarm and confusion from the bandits on the trail above. The orc woman dodged between trees with a grace that seemed at odds with her size, her breathing steady even with his weight on her shoulders. Once he heard the snap of a bowstring and the thunk of an arrow embedding itself in wood somewhere close by, but she did not slow. Time became meaningless. Kieran drifted in and out of awareness, each jolt of her running gait sending fresh spikes of agony through his shoulder. He thought he might have passed out completely for a while, because the next thing he knew the quality of light had changed, and the sounds of pursuit had faded to nothing. His mouth tasted of copper, and his shirt was glued to his skin with drying blood. The orc woman slowed to a walk, then stopped entirely. Kieran felt himself being lowered to the ground with surprising gentleness, his back coming to rest against something solid. A tree trunk, he realized distantly. They were in a small clearing, late afternoon sun slanting through the leaves overhead. A stream burbled somewhere nearby. "Stay awake," a voice commanded, and he forced his eyes to focus on the face hovering above him. The orc woman was crouched at his side, her expression intense. Up close, he could see the fine details he had missed before the slight upturn of her nose, the faint scarring along her jawline, the way her amber eyes caught the light like polished stones. "Why?" he asked, the word coming out slurred. "Why help me?" She did not answer, already turning her attention to his shoulder. Her hands moved over his armor with practiced efficiency, unbuckling straps and peeling away layers to expose the wound beneath. When she saw it clearly, she made a sound low in her throat that might have been disapproval. "This will hurt," she warned. Before Kieran could brace himself, she snapped the protruding end of the crossbow bolt with her bare hands. He did scream then, the sound tearing from his throat before he could stop it, and his vision went white at the edges. When it cleared again, she was packing the wound with something moss. He realized, clean green moss from the stream bank pressed tight against both entry and exit holes. "You need a healer," she said, not looking at him. "This will stop the bleeding for now, but the bolt might have touched bone. Might be fragments inside." "No healers," Kieran gasped. "Not for 3 days' walk, maybe more." The orc woman sat back on her heels, studying him with an unreadable expression. Blood stained her hands, his blood dark against her green skin. "Then you will probably die," she said matter-of-factly. "But not today. Today you are alive because I carried you a mile, and those bandits decided chasing an orc into deep forest was not worth their trouble." A mile. She had carried him a mile through rough terrain while bandits pursued them. Kieran stared at her, trying to reconcile the creature from human stories savage, brutal, monstrous with the woman who had just saved his life. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if deciding whether to answer. "Graka," she said finally. "Graka Stonefist, though I have no clan anymore to give meaning to that name. And you?" "Kieran Jamison. I was a caravan guard, past tense I suppose since the caravan is dead and scattered." Graka nodded slowly. "I heard the ambush, heard the screams. I was checking my trap line a quarter-mile north when it started." She paused, her gaze distant. "I should have stayed away. It is not my place to interfere in human conflicts, but when I saw you in the ravine, saw you were about to be killed by 6 cowards." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I am a fool." "You saved my life," Kieran said. "That does not make you a fool." "It makes me a fool to my people, who would say I wasted effort on a human who will likely die anyway. It makes me a fool to your people, who would kill me on sight if they knew an orc had touched one of their own." She stood abruptly, turning away from him. "Rest now. I need to gather supplies if you are going to survive the night." She disappeared into the forest before Kieran could respond, moving silently between the trees until even her footfalls faded to nothing. He sat alone against the tree trunk, his shoulder throbbing in time with his heartbeat, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. An orc had saved him. An orc woman had carried him to safety, tended his wound, and now was gathering supplies to keep him alive. It went against everything he had been taught growing up in the border settlements. Orcs were the enemy. Orcs raided farms, burned villages, took prisoners they never returned. The garrison soldiers who rotated through the frontier told stories around campfires about orc war parties that could tear a man apart with their bare hands, about the inhuman strength and savage nature that made them more beast than person. But Graka had not torn him apart. She had saved him. The sun continued its descent while Kieran waited, painting the forest in shades of amber and gold. His shoulder had settled into a dull, constant ache, and he found that if he kept very still the pain was almost bearable. Almost. He could feel fever starting to build in his blood, a warning sign he knew too well from his years of watching wounded soldiers and travelers. Infection would come next if he was unlucky, and in these woods with no proper medicine, infection would be a death sentence as sure as any bandit's blade. Graka returned just as the light was beginning to fail, her arms full of plants and roots Kieran did not recognize. She had also brought water in a leather flask and what looked like dried meat wrapped in cloth. She set everything down beside him and immediately began crushing some of the roots between two flat stones, working them into a paste. "Willow bark for pain," she explained without looking up. "These mushrooms will help with infection. This moss I already used on the wound, but I will change it before night. You need to eat something, even if you do not feel hungry. Your body needs strength to heal." She spoke with the confidence of someone who had done this before, and Kieran watched her work with growing curiosity. "You have medical training." Graka glanced at him briefly, something that might have been amusement flickering across her face. "I have survival training. When you live alone in the wilderness, you learn to tend your own wounds or you die. I have set my own broken bones, stitched my own cuts, burned out infections with hot iron." She held up the paste she had been making. "This is nothing compared to that." "Why do you live alone?" Kieran asked. "You said you have no clan anymore." Her hands stilled for just a moment before resuming their work. "That is not a story for tonight. Open your mouth." He obeyed, too weak to argue, and she spooned the bitter paste onto his tongue. It tasted like dirt and rot, and he had to force himself to swallow. She followed it with water from the flask, then unwrapped the dried meat and pressed a piece into his hand. "Eat," she commanded. "Slowly. If you vomit it up, I will make you eat it again." Kieran ate, though each bite seemed to take tremendous effort. The meat was tough and gamey, probably venison, and he had to chew it far longer than he wanted before he could swallow. Graka watched him the entire time, her expression unreadable, and only when he had finished did she turn her attention to gathering firewood. "Will a fire not draw attention?" Kieran asked. "The bandits will not come this deep, not after dark and not following an orc's trail. They are cowards who prey on the weak and unprepared. They will go back to whatever hole they crawled from and celebrate their successful ambush." She arranged the wood with practiced efficiency. "Besides, you need warmth. Fever is coming, I can see it in your eyes. Without heat you will spend the night shivering and your wound will not heal properly." She struck sparks from a flint and had a small fire crackling within minutes. The warmth was immediate and profound, and Kieran had not realized how cold he had gotten until the heat washed over him. Graka settled on the opposite side of the fire, her amber eyes reflecting the flames, and for a time they sat in silence. Night fell completely, bringing with it the sounds of the forest after dark. Owls called to each other in the distance. Something small rustled through the underbrush nearby. The fire popped and sparked, sending occasional embers spiraling up into the darkness. Kieran felt himself starting to drift, exhaustion pulling at him like an undertow, but he forced his eyes open. He did not know this woman, did not know if he could trust her, and some part of him insisted he needed to stay alert. "You can sleep," Graka said quietly, as if reading his thoughts. "I will keep watch." "Why should I trust you?" The words came out before Kieran could stop them, blunt and graceless. Graka was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried an edge of something bitter. "You should not. I am an orc, after all. Your people's stories say we are monsters. Savages. Killers who cannot be trusted." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. "But I am the one who carried you to safety. I am the one who tended your wound and gave you medicine. I am the one sitting here keeping watch while you decide whether to trust me." She looked up, meeting his gaze across the flames. "Sleep or do not sleep, human, it makes no difference to me." Kieran felt shame burn in his chest, hot and uncomfortable. She was right. She had done nothing but help him, and he had responded with suspicion and distrust. He thought about apologizing, but the words would not come. Instead, he let his eyes drift closed, too exhausted to fight anymore, and somewhere between one breath and the next he fell into uneasy sleep. He dreamed of the ambush, of crossbow bolts and screaming horses and blood in the mud. He dreamed of falling, of knowing he was going to die, of rough hands reaching for him with daggers drawn. But then the dream shifted, and there was green skin and amber eyes, and a voice telling him to be quiet, and the sensation of being lifted and carried away from death. Kieran woke to gray dawn light, and the smell of something cooking. His shoulder felt like molten iron had been poured into the joint, but when he tried to move his fingers, his right hand responded, which he took as a good sign. Graka was crouched by the fire, turning something on a makeshift spit to fish, he realized, probably caught from the nearby stream while he slept. "You are awake," she said without looking at him. "Good. You made it through the night. The fever is not as bad as it could have been." Kieran tried to sit up straighter and immediately regretted it as pain lanced through his shoulder. Graka was at his side in an instant, one hand steadying him, the other checking the moss bandage on his wound. "Do not move suddenly," she scolded. "The bolt went clean through, but you tore muscle. It will take weeks to heal properly, and that is only if infection does not set in." "I need to get to a settlement," Kieran said. "Need to report what happened, get proper medical attention. The merchant's family needs to be notified." "You need to stay still and heal," Graka countered. "The nearest settlement is 3 days' walk, even for someone healthy and whole. In your condition, it might as well be on the moon." "Then what do you suggest? That I stay here in the woods forever?" "I suggest you stay here until you can walk without passing out. Then we will talk about settlements." She returned to the fire and used a flat stone to transfer one of the cooked fish to another stone which she brought to him. "Eat. You need strength." The fish was plain but fresh, and Kieran ate it gratefully, using his left hand to pick the meat from the bones. Graka ate her own portion in silence, then cleaned the stones in the stream and scattered the fire. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had done these tasks thousands of times, and Kieran found himself watching her with growing fascination. In daylight, he could see details he had missed the night before. She wore her leather armor strapped tight over a tunic that had been repaired many times, the patches visible in different shades of fabric. A hunting knife hung at her belt in a worn sheath, and he could see the handles of other tools tucked into her pack. Her hands were calloused and scarred, the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, and her arms showed the kind of muscle definition that came from years of hard physical labor. She was, he realized with some surprise, not unattractive. Different, certainly. Alien in ways that his mind struggled to reconcile with human features, but there was a strength and grace to her movements, an intelligence in her eyes that he could not help but notice. "You are staring," Graka said without turning around. Kieran felt heat rise to his face. "Sorry. I have just never been this close to an orc before, not without weapons drawn. And what do you think now that you have been?" She turned to face him, her expression challenging. "Am I the monster from your stories?" "No," Kieran admitted. "You are not." Something shifted in her expression, too quick for him to read. She gathered her pack and slung it over her shoulder. "Can you walk?" Kieran tested his weight on his legs, using the tree trunk for support. His shoulders screamed in protest, but he managed to get upright without falling. "I can walk." "Then follow me. My shelter is about 2 miles from here. You will recover there." "Your shelter? You are taking me to your home?" Graka looked at him with an expression that was almost pitying. "You cannot stay here in the open, and I cannot build you a proper shelter while also hunting and gathering food. My home has walls, a roof, supplies. You will heal faster there." She paused. "Unless you would prefer I leave you here to take your chances alone." "No," Kieran said quickly. "I will come with you, and thank you for everything." Graka nodded once, then set off into the forest. Kieran followed, trying to ignore the pain that radiated from his shoulder with every step. 2 miles might as well have been 20 in his condition, but he gritted his teeth and pushed forward. The alternative was dying alone in the woods, and after everything Graka had done to save him, that seemed like a poor way to repay her effort. They walked for what felt like hours. Graka set a slow pace, clearly accommodating his injury, and stopped frequently to let him rest. She never complained, never showed impatience, simply waited until he nodded that he was ready to continue. Kieran found himself grateful beyond words for her presence, even as part of his mind continued to insist this situation was deeply strange. The sun was high overhead when they finally reached her shelter. It sat in a small clearing, backed against a rocky outcrop that provided natural protection from wind and weather. The structure itself was simple, but well-made. Thick logs fitted together and chinked with mud and moss. A slanted roof of bark and thatch, a single door made of rough planks. A small garden plot had been cleared nearby, though it looked like it had not been tended recently, and he could see a smokehouse and what might have been a root cellar dug into the hillside. "Home," Graka said simply, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost defensive. "You built all this yourself?" Kieran asked. "I had time. I have been here for 3 years." She pushed open the door and gestured for him to enter. The interior was dim and cool, lit only by the light from the doorway and a single small window. As his eyes adjusted, Kieran could make out a simple layout: a sleeping pallet in one corner, a fire pit in the center with a smoke hole above, shelves holding tools and supplies, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Everything was neat and organized, the space of someone who lived alone and had developed systems for survival. Graka pointed to the pallet. "You will sleep there. I will make a bed for myself near the door." "I cannot take your bed," Kieran protested. "You can and you will. You are injured and need proper rest. I have slept on harder ground than this floor." Her tone left no room for argument. Kieran lowered himself onto the pallet gratefully, every muscle in his body trembling with exhaustion. The furs were soft and smelled faintly of wood smoke and something else, something he could not quite identify. Graka was already moving around the space, gathering supplies, building up the fire in the pit. She brought him water in a carved wooden cup, then more of the bitter medicine from the night before. "Sleep now," she said. "I will wake you later to eat." Kieran wanted to stay awake, wanted to talk to her, to understand who she was and why she lived alone and what had happened to make her clanless. But his body had other ideas, and within minutes, He was falling into deep, dreamless sleep. The next several days passed in a haze of pain and fever and healing. Kieran drifted in and out of awareness, sometimes waking to find Graka changing his bandages or spooning broth into his mouth, sometimes waking to find her gone and the shelter empty except for the crackling fire. She was patient with him in a way he had never experienced, never irritated by his weakness or his need for constant care. She cleaned his wound twice daily, applying fresh poultices that smelled of herbs and mushrooms. She fed him soup and tea and small portions of meat. She helped him to the latrine she had dug behind the shelter when he was too weak to walk alone, never commenting on his embarrassment at needing assistance with such basic functions. On the fourth day, Kieran woke feeling more himself than he had since the ambush. The fever had broken in the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed. His shoulder still ached, but the sharp, tearing pain had dulled to something more manageable. He sat up slowly, testing his range of motion, and was pleased to find he could move his right arm slightly without wanting to scream. Graka was sitting by the fire, working on something with her knife. When she noticed him stirring, she looked up, and he could have sworn he saw relief flicker across her face. "The fever broke," she said. "Good. I was beginning to worry. How long have I been here?" 4 days. 4 days and nights of you sweating and shaking and talking in your sleep. She returned her attention to whatever she was carving. "You spoke of many things. A woman named Sarah, a place called Millbrook, brothers you have not seen in years." Kieran felt his chest tighten. "Sarah was my sister. She died 5 years ago when raiders hit our farm. My brothers and I were working in the fields when it happened. We heard her screaming, but by the time we got back..." He trailed off, the old guilt rising up like bile in his throat. Graka was quiet for a long moment. "I am sorry," she said finally, and he could hear that she meant it. "Loss is a wound that never fully heals. Is that why you live alone? Because of loss?" She set down her carving and the knife, her expression becoming shuttered. "I live alone because I no longer have a place among my people. I was born into the Stonefist clan, a large and powerful family in the Northern Territories. My father was a war chief, my mother a respected elder. I had 2 brothers and a sister, all warriors of great skill." She stared into the fire, her voice going distant. 3 years ago, human soldiers raided our settlement. They came in the night, set fires, killed anyone who resisted. My father was cut down defending the clan hall. My mother was struck down trying to reach him. My brothers died fighting side by side near the south gate." "And your sister?" Kieran asked quietly. "My sister survived. She blamed me for our family's death because I was not there when it happened. I had been out hunting, far from the settlement, and returned to find everything burning." Graka's hands clenched into fists. "She said I was a coward. That a true warrior would have died with her family rather than live with the shame. The clan elders agreed. They stripped my name and cast me out, told me I was clanless, worthless, no better than an animal." "That is not fair," Kieran said, anger flaring in his chest. "You were not there. You could not have known. Fair or not, it is done. I have no clan, no family, no place among my people. So I built this shelter, and I have lived here alone for 3 years, surviving, existing, but not truly living." She looked at him then, and her amber eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "Until 4 days ago, when I made the foolish decision to save a dying human's life." Kieran held her gaze, seeing the pain and loneliness behind her words. He understood it because he carried his own version of the same wounds. "I am glad you made that decision," he said softly. "I am glad you saved me." Graka looked away first, blinking rapidly. "You should eat something. You have been surviving on broth for days, and you need real food to regain your strength." She busied herself preparing a meal, and Kieran let the subject drop. But something had shifted between them. Some wall that had been carefully maintained had developed a crack. They ate together in companionable silence, and afterward Graka helped him outside to sit in the sun for a while. The fresh air and warmth felt like a gift after days confined to the dim interior of the shelter. Over the following week, Kieran grew stronger. He graduated from being confined to the pallet to being able to move around the shelter, then to helping with simple tasks. He could not do much with his injured arm, but he could use his left hand to prepare vegetables for meals, to tend the fire, to fold and organize supplies. Graka accepted his help without comment, working alongside him in an easy partnership that surprised them both. They talked as they worked, at first just small things: the weather, the best places to find mushrooms in the forest, techniques for preserving meat. But gradually, the conversations deepened. Kieran told her about his life before becoming a caravan guard, about growing up on a farm with 4 siblings, about learning to fight after Sarah's death, because he never wanted to feel that helpless again. Graka told him about orc culture, about the complex clan structures and honor codes that governed their society, about growing up knowing she would be expected to become a warrior like her father. "You miss it?" Kieran asked one evening as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Your old life, your clan." Graka considered the question for a long time. "I miss my family," she said finally. "I miss my mother's wisdom and my father's strength. I miss sparring with my brothers and laughing with my sister. But the clan itself," she shook her head. "The clan cast me out when I needed them most. They chose judgment over compassion, tradition over understanding. So no, I do not miss them. I miss what I thought they were, but I do not miss what they truly are. That must be lonely." "It is," she admitted. "Some days the silence is so complete it feels like I might disappear into it. Some days I talk to myself just to remember what voices sound like." She glanced at him. "These past days, having someone else here, it has been strange. Good, but strange. I had forgotten what it was like to share space with another person." "I know what you mean," Kieran said. "I have spent the last 4 years moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections. It is easier that way, safer. If you do not let people get close, they cannot hurt you when they leave." "But it is a hollow kind of safety," Graka said softly. "A cage made of your own fear." "Yes," Kieran agreed. "Yes, it is." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge overhead. Kieran found himself acutely aware of Graka's presence beside him, of the warmth radiating from her body, of the way her profile looked outlined against the darkening sky. It was a strange feeling, this growing comfort with her presence, this sense that he was perhaps safer here in the middle of nowhere with an orc woman than he had been anywhere else in years. 2 weeks after the ambush, Kieran's shoulder had healed enough that he could move his arm through most of its full range of motion. Though lifting anything heavy still sent sharp pains radiating down to his fingertips. Graka declared him recovered enough to begin light work, and she put him to task helping repair and expand her garden plot. The physical labor felt good after so many days of enforced rest, and he threw himself into the work with enthusiasm. They worked side by side through the warm summer days, turning soil, pulling weeds, planting seeds from Graka's carefully hoarded stores. She taught him which plants were good for food and which for medicine, which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill a man in hours. He taught her a planting technique his father had used back on the farm that helped vegetables grow stronger in poor soil. They fell into an easy rhythm, moving around each other with the unconscious coordination of people who had worked together for years rather than weeks. One afternoon, as they took a break in the shade of the shelter, Kieran realized he was happy. The thought struck him with surprising force. He was happy here, in this tiny clearing in the middle of nowhere with an orc woman who had saved his life. It made no sense. He should have been eager to return to civilization, to find new work, to get back to the life he had known. Instead, the thought of leaving made his chest tight with something that felt uncomfortably like dread. "You are thinking loudly," Graka said, and he looked up to find her watching him with amusement. "I can practically hear the wheels turning in your head." "I was just thinking that I should probably start planning my return to the settlements," Kieran lied. "My shoulder is nearly healed. I have imposed on your hospitality long enough." Something flickered in Graka's expression, there and gone too quickly to identify. "You have not imposed. You have been helpful once you recovered enough to work. But yes, I suppose you must want to return to your own people. To civilization." "Do you ever go to the settlements?" Kieran asked. "To trade or gather news?" Graka shook her head. "I avoid human settlements. I am not welcome there, and the risk of violence is too high. Once or twice a year I trade with a trapper who works this territory, but otherwise I am completely isolated." She paused. "It is safer that way. Safer but lonely." "Yes," she agreed quietly, "but loneliness is better than a knife in the back from someone who sees me as a monster." Kieran wanted to argue, to tell her that not all humans were like that, but he could not. He had seen how border settlers treated orcs, had heard the casual cruelty in the way people spoke about them. He had participated in it himself before the ambush, accepting without question the idea that orcs were enemies to be feared and fought. Graka had every reason to avoid human settlements, and he could not blame her for choosing safety over connection. "I am not ready to leave yet anyway," he said finally. "My shoulder still needs more time, and I want to help you finish the garden plot first. It is the least I can do after everything you have done for me." Relief washed over Graka's face so clearly that it made Kieran's heart ache. "If you are sure," she said, trying to sound casual, "the help would be appreciated, I am sure." They returned to work, and Kieran tried not to examine too closely why the thought of staying made him so relieved. The days stretched into weeks. Summer deepened, bringing warm nights and abundant growth in the forest. The garden plot flourished under their combined care, producing vegetables that supplemented the meat from Graka's hunting and the fish from the streams. They developed routines and rhythms, dividing tasks based on their individual strengths. Graka hunted and foraged, her knowledge of the forest far exceeding his own. Kieran handled the garden and the cooking, discovering he had a talent for turning simple ingredients into surprisingly good meals. They talked constantly, sharing stories and knowledge and opinions. Graka had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that caught Kieran off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. Kieran found he could make her smile by describing the absurd situations he had encountered during his years. As a caravan guard, the merchant who insisted on bringing a pet chicken on a 3-week journey. The noble lady who had fallen in love with her bodyguard and caused endless drama. The time an entire wagon of expensive wine had overturned and created a river of red that local villagers treated like a miracle. One evening, as they were preparing dinner, Graka asked him why he had become a caravan guard in the first place. "After Sarah died, I could not stay on the farm," Kieran said, chopping carrots with his left hand while his right arm continued to heal. "Everything reminded me of her. The house, the fields, the barn where we used to hide and tell stories. My brothers wanted to rebuild, to continue working the land, but I could not do it. So I left. Took what money I had saved and headed for the frontier territories, figuring I could find work as hired protection." "Did your brothers understand?" "I do not think so. We have not spoken since I left. I sent letters a few times in the first year, but they never responded. I think they saw my leaving as a betrayal, another abandonment when we should have stayed together." He set down the knife, his throat tight. Maybe they were right. Graka reached out and placed her hand over his, the touch gentle despite her obvious strength. "Grief makes us do things that do not make sense to others. You needed to leave, so you left. That does not make you a coward or a traitor. It makes you someone who was in pain and trying to survive." Kieran looked down at her hand on his green skin against his own pale flesh and felt something shift in his chest. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for understanding." "I know something about running from pain," Graka said, pulling her hand back slowly. "I have been doing it for 3 years. That night, as Kieran lay on the pallet trying to sleep, he could not stop thinking about the touch of her hand on his, about the warmth in her eyes when she looked at him, about the way his heart sped up whenever she smiled. He tried to tell himself it was just gratitude, just the natural bond that formed between people who had been through trauma together. But he knew, with a certainty that frightened him, that it was more than that. He was falling in love with her. The realization should have terrified him. She was an orc. He was human. Their peoples were enemies. Any relationship between them was forbidden by both their cultures, doomed before it could even begin. But lying there in the dark, listening to her breathing from where she slept near the door, all Kieran could feel was a deep, aching longing for something he had no right to want. The next morning, Kieran woke to find Graka already gone. It was not unusual. She often left at dawn to check her trap lines or hunt, but something about the way she had packed her gear suggested she would be gone longer than usual. He spent the day working in the garden, trying not to worry, trying not to think about what it meant that her absence made the shelter feel empty and wrong. She returned just before sunset, a deer slung over her shoulders and blood streaked across her arms. She looked exhausted but satisfied, and Kieran helped her string up the carcass to butcher properly. "Good hunt?" he asked. "Very good. This will provide meat for weeks if we smoke it properly." She wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a smear of dirt across her green skin. "How was your day?" "Quiet, productive. I finished weeding the entire garden plot and repaired the weak spot in the smokehouse wall you mentioned." "You have been busy." Graka gave him an appraising look. "Your shoulder must be nearly fully healed if you can do that kind of work." "It is better," Kieran admitted. "Still twinges if I move wrong, but mostly it feels normal again." "That is good." Something in her voice sounded strained, and when Kieran looked at her closely he saw tension around her eyes. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong. I am merely tired from the hunt." But she would not meet his gaze, and Kieran knew she was lying. They worked in silence to butcher the deer, a task that required focus and precision. By the time they were finished, full dark had fallen and they were both spattered with blood and exhausted. Graka heated water for washing while Kieran prepared a simple meal of bread and cheese. They ate quickly, the earlier ease between them replaced by an awkward tension Kieran did not understand. Finally, as they were cleaning up after the meal, Graka spoke. "You will be leaving soon." It was not a question, and her tone was carefully neutral. Kieran set down the bowl he had been washing and turned to face her. "I do not have to leave immediately. Your shoulder is healed. You have no reason to stay. Maybe I have reasons that have nothing to do with my injury." Graka went very still. "What reasons?" Kieran took a breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff but unable to stop himself. "I like it here. I like the work, the peace, the simplicity. I like not having to watch my back constantly or wonder if the person sleeping in the next camp is going to rob me in the night. I like—" He hesitated, then forced himself to continue. "I like being with you, Kieran." His name was barely a whisper. "You do not know what you are saying." I know exactly what I am saying. I have been thinking about it for weeks now. He moved closer to her, close enough to see the way her breathing had quickened. You saved my life. You cared for me when I was helpless. You shared your home and your knowledge and your company. You made me feel safe for the first time in years. How could I not care about you? I am an orc, Graka said, and there was pain in her voice. You are human. We are enemies by birth. Any feelings between us are impossible, forbidden, doomed. Maybe, but that does not make them any less real. Graka closed her eyes, her jaw clenched tight. When she opened them again, Kieran saw tears tracking down her cheeks. You do not understand. If you stay, if we pursue this, we will both be outcasts. Your people will reject you for being with an orc. My people have already rejected me, but if word got out that I took a human as a mate, they would hunt me down and kill me as a traitor. Then we do not tell anyone. We stay here in this clearing away from both our peoples. For how long? Forever. You would give up civilization, family, any chance at a normal life to live in isolation with me. Yes, Kieran said simply. If you will have me, yes. Graka stared at him, her expression a mixture of hope and terror. Why? Because I am falling in love with you, Kieran said, the words coming out raw and honest. Because when I think about leaving this place, leaving you, it feels like something vital is being torn out of my chest. Because I am happier here in this tiny shelter in the middle of nowhere than I have been anywhere else in my entire life. Because you see me, truly see me, in a way no one else ever has. Kieran, she breathed, and then she was moving, closing the distance between them, her hands coming up to cup his face with surprising gentleness. I am falling in love with you too. It terrifies me, but I cannot deny it anymore. He reached up to cover her hands with his own, marveling at the feel of her skin against his palm. Then let me stay, please. Let me stay and we will figure out the rest as we go. For a long moment, Graka just looked at him, searching his face for something. Then, slowly, she nodded. Stay, she whispered. Stay with me. Kieran pulled her into his arms, mindful of his still healing shoulder, and held her close. She was warm and solid and real, and the feel of her pressed against him made his heart race. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other, letting the significance of what they had admitted settle over them. When they finally pulled apart, Graka was smiling through her tears. This is madness, she said, but there was joy in her voice. The best things usually are, Kieran replied. That night they talked until the fire burned low, making plans and sharing dreams and simply reveling in the freedom to be honest about their feelings. Graka told him about the life she had imagined before her exile, about the mate she had expected to choose from among her clan's warriors, about the children she had wanted to raise. Kieran told her about the farm he had once dreamed of buying, about wanting a family of his own after losing Sarah, about the loneliness that had haunted him for years. We can have those things here, Kieran said as they sat close together by the dying fire. Not exactly as we imagined, but our own version. We can build a life together in this clearing. It will not be easy, but it will be ours. You are very optimistic for someone who nearly died a month ago, Graka teased gently. You give me reason to be optimistic. She leaned her head against his shoulder, careful of his injury, and he wrapped his good arm around her. They sat like that until the fire burned to embers, content in each other's presence, neither willing to break the peaceful moment. The days that followed were filled with work and laughter, and a growing sense of partnership that went beyond simple cooperation. They expanded the shelter to make it more comfortable for two people. They increased the size of the garden. They built a second smokehouse to handle larger stores of meat. Every task was done together, and every small achievement felt like a victory. They were also learning the physical aspects of their relationship, navigating the differences in their bodies with patience and curiosity. Graka was stronger than Kieran, something she tried to be mindful of when they embraced or worked together. Kieran was gentler than the orc males she had known in her clan, something that surprised and pleased her. They kissed often, testing the feel of tusks and lips together, learning each other's boundaries and preferences. One evening, about 2 months after Kieran had decided to stay, they made love for the first time. It was awkward and sweet and occasionally clumsy as they navigated unfamiliar territory, but it was also deeply right. Afterward, lying tangled together on the enlarged pallet they now shared, Kieran felt a sense of belonging he had never experienced before. "I love you," he said into the darkness, the words easy now that he had said them before. "I love you too," Graka replied, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his chest. "More than I thought possible. Do you regret this, choosing me?" "Never." She propped herself up on one elbow to look down at him, her amber eyes serious in the dim light from the banked fire. "You are the best thing that has happened to me in 3 years, maybe in my entire life. I do not regret a single moment." Kieran pulled her down for a kiss, pouring all his love and gratitude into it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he smiled. "We should probably sleep. Morning comes early." "It does." But Graka made no move to separate from him, and Kieran was more than happy to fall asleep with her in his arms. Late summer gave way to early fall, bringing cooler nights and the first hints of changing colors in the forest canopy. They worked hard to prepare for the coming winter, smoking and drying meat, preserving vegetables in the expanded root cellar, gathering firewood and stacking it under a new shelter Kieran had built to keep it dry. Graka taught him how to make warm winter clothing from deer hide and fur, and he proved surprisingly adept at the detailed work of sewing and crafting. They saw no other humans during those months, which suited them both fine. The clearing felt like its own world, separate from the conflicts and prejudices of the wider land. Here they were just Kieran and Graka, 2 people who loved each other and were building a life together. The rest of the world and its rules and expectations seemed very far away. But the world has a way of intruding even when you wish it would not. It was late afternoon on a crisp autumn day when Kieran heard the sound of voices in the forest. He was working in the garden, harvesting the last of the squash before the first hard frost, while Graka was out checking her trap lines. The voices were distant but unmistakably human, multiple speakers moving through the forest without any particular attempt at stealth. Kieran's heart began to race. He abandoned the garden and moved quickly toward the shelter, planning to grab his sword and hide in the forest until whoever it was passed by. But before he could reach the door, 3 men emerged from the trees at the edge of the clearing. They were rough-looking, dressed in mismatched leather armor and carrying weapons that had seen hard use. Bandits, Kieran realized with a sinking feeling, or possibly deserters from one of the border garrisons. Their eyes locked onto him with predatory interest. "Well, what do we have here?" The largest of them said, grinning to reveal missing teeth. "A settlement way out in the middle of nowhere. Must be a hermit or a fugitive. Either way, looks like we just found fresh supplies." "I do not want trouble," Kieran said, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "I have nothing worth stealing, just some food and basic supplies." "We will be the judge of that," another one said, moving to flank Kieran from the side. "Why do not you show us inside that nice shelter you have got there?" Kieran's mind raced. If they went inside, they would see immediately that 2 people lived there, would find Graka's things, would realize an orc lived here. Even if they did not hurt him, they might wait in ambush for her return, and 3 against 1 were bad odds even for someone of Graka's skill. "Listen," he tried again, backing toward the shelter. Just take what you can carry from the garden. Take whatever you find out here, but leave the shelter alone." "Not how this works, friend," the leader said, drawing a long knife. "Now open the door or we open it for you, and things will go much worse if we have to do it ourselves." Kieran was reaching for the door handle, trying desperately to think of a way out of this, when a voice cut through the clearing like a whip crack. "Step away from him." All four of them turned to see Graka standing at the opposite edge of the clearing, her hunting bow drawn and an arrow nocked. She had approached so silently that none of them had heard her, and her sudden appearance made the bandits stumble back in surprise. "An orc," one of them shouted. "There is a monster here. The only monsters I see are 3 humans threatening my home," Graka said coldly. "You have 3 seconds to leave before I start shooting." 1. "You think you can take all 3 of us, orc?" the leader snarled, trying to recover his bravado. 2. "She is bluffing," another bandit said, but his voice shook slightly. 3. Graka loosed her arrow, and it struck the ground between the leader's feet with enough force to bury itself several inches deep. Before any of them could react, she had another arrow nocked and drawn. "Next one goes through someone's knee. After that, I aim for throats. Your choice." The bandits looked at each other, clearly weighing their options. Kieran tensed, ready to fight if they decided to charge. But Graka was absolutely still, radiating the kind of cold competence that came from years of survival, and apparently they decided 3 men were not good enough odds against an orc with a bow. "This is not over," the leader spat as they began backing toward the forest. "We will be back with more men. We will burn this place to the ground. If you try, you will die screaming," Graka promised. "Now get out of my sight." They fled into the trees, and within moments the sound of their passage faded to nothing. Graka held her position for several more seconds, then slowly lowered her bow. When she looked at Kieran, he saw fear and fury warring in her expression. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No, you got here in time. Thank you." "We need to leave," Graka said abruptly. "Those men will tell others about this place, about me. They will come back, probably with soldiers or garrison men. We cannot stay here." The words hit Kieran like a physical blow. Leave? Leave the home they had built together, the clearing that had become their sanctuary. But even as he wanted to argue, he knew she was right. The world had found them, and it was not going to let them exist in peace. "Where will we go?" he asked, deeper into the forest, north toward the mountains. "I know of places where humans rarely go, where we can build another shelter and start again." She was already moving, heading into the shelter to gather essential supplies. "We need to leave tonight. Take only what we can carry." They worked quickly and efficiently, packing food and tools and warm clothing into leather packs. Kieran felt a deep sadness as he looked around the shelter that had become home, at the garden they had tended together, at the life they were being forced to abandon. But Graka was right, staying meant discovery, and discovery meant death for one or both of them. As the sun set, they left the clearing, moving north through the darkening forest. Graka led the way with the confidence of someone who knew this terrain intimately, and Kieran followed close behind. They walked through the night, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and the clearing. "I am sorry," Kieran said during one of their brief rests. "This is my fault. If I had been more careful, if I had hidden better—" "This is not your fault," Graka interrupted. "We knew this peace could not last forever. We were living on borrowed time from the moment you decided to stay. Do you regret it, letting me stay?" She turned to face him, reaching out to take his hand in hers. "Never, not for a single moment. I would rather have had these months with you and lose everything than have spent another year alone in that clearing." Kieran squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her touch. "Where we are going, will there be others? Other orcs, possibly?" The deep northern territories are home to several clans that have minimal contact with humans. They keep to themselves, maintain the old ways. If we are careful, we can live near enough to trade occasionally but far enough to not draw attention. She paused. But if my sister's clan is in that region, we will need to avoid them completely. We will make it work, Kieran said with more confidence than he felt. We have come this far together. We can handle whatever comes next. They walked for 3 days, stopping only to rest and eat. The terrain grew progressively more difficult as they moved into the foothills of the northern mountains. But Graka navigated it with the ease of someone who had traveled these paths before. On the 4th day, they found what she was looking for, a narrow valley tucked between 2 ridges, with a stream running through it and good southern exposure for growing food. Here, she said, setting down her pack. This place should work. Remote enough to avoid discovery, close enough to water and game to support us. They spent the next several weeks building a new shelter, smaller than the one they had left but adequate for their needs. The work was hard and the nights were growing cold, but they threw themselves into it with determination. This was their second chance, their new beginning, and they were not going to waste it. As they worked, Kieran found himself thinking about the future more concretely. "Graka," he said one evening as they ate dinner by their campfire, "I want to marry you." She looked up in surprise. "Marry? Humans have marriage ceremonies. Orcs have mating bonds. They are not the same thing." "Then we will do both, or we will create our own ceremony that honors both traditions." "I do not care about the specifics. I just want you to know that I am committed to you for the rest of my life, in whatever way makes that most clear." Graka's eyes went suspiciously bright. "You would marry someone your people call a monster." "I would bond myself to the person I love, who happens to be the strongest, smartest, most courageous woman I have ever met. The rest is just noise." She set down her food and moved to sit beside him, taking his face in her hands. "Then yes. However we choose to do it, yes. I want to be bonded to you in every way that matters." They kissed as the fire crackled between them, and Kieran felt a sense of rightness settle over him like a warm blanket. This was where he was meant to be, with this woman in this place, building a life that was entirely their own. The next day, Graka led him to a small grove of ancient pines about a half-mile from their new shelter. "This is a sacred place," she explained. "My grandmother told me about it when I was young. She said that bonds forged here were blessed by the old spirits of the forest." They had brought nothing except themselves, and the knife Kieran had carried since his caravan guard days. Following Graka's instructions, they each made small cuts on their palms and pressed them together, mingling their blood while they spoke their vows. "I, Graka Stonefist, though clanless and exiled, take you Kieran Jamison as my mate and partner," Graka said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I promise to stand beside you in strength and in weakness, in joy and in sorrow, for as long as we both draw breath." "I, Kieran Jamison, take you Graka Stonefist as my wife and partner," Kieran replied, his own voice thick with emotion. "I promise to honor you, to protect you, to love you without reservation, for as long as we both draw breath." They sealed the vow with a kiss, their joined hands still pressed together between them. When they pulled apart, Graka used a strip of cloth to bind their hands together. "In my culture, couples wear this binding for 3 days after mating to symbolize their permanent connection," she explained. "It is inconvenient and uncomfortable, which is supposed to teach patience and cooperation." Kieran laughed despite his tears. "Then we had better get very good at working together." They spent those 3 days completing their shelter with their hands bound, learning to coordinate their movements in new ways, laughing at their clumsiness and celebrating their successes. By the time they cut the binding away, Their new home was complete, small but sturdy, well insulated against the coming winter, and unmistakably theirs. Winter came early and hard that year, blanketing the valley in snow and confining them to the shelter for days at a time. But they had prepared well, and their stores of food and firewood were more than adequate. They passed the long, dark evenings telling stories, making plans for spring, and simply enjoying each other's company. One night, as wind howled outside and snow piled against the walls, Graka asked Kieran if he missed his old life. "Sometimes," he admitted. "I miss my brothers, wonder how they are doing. I miss certain comforts of civilization, but miss it enough to go back. No, never. This life with you is harder in many ways, but it is also infinitely richer. I am more myself here than I ever was before." "I understand that feeling," Graka said softly. "I spent 3 years alone, surviving but not living. You taught me the difference. You taught me that exile does not have to mean isolation, that being clanless does not have to mean being alone." "We are our own clan now," Kieran said. "A clan of 2, maybe someday more if we are blessed with children." Graka smiled, a hand drifting to her stomach. "About that, I have been meaning to tell you, I believe I am already carrying our child." Kieran sat up so fast he nearly hit his head on the low ceiling. "What? Are you serious? How long have you known?" "I suspected for a few weeks, but I wanted to be certain before I said anything. My moon cycle has stopped, and I have been feeling the early signs my mother told me about when she was pregnant with my youngest brother." She watched him nervously. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased." Kieran pulled her into his arms, laughing and crying at the same time. "I am overjoyed. Terrified, but overjoyed. We are going to be parents." They held each other while the storm raged outside, making plans and sharing fears and marveling at the new life growing between them. It felt like a miracle, this proof that human and orc could create something beautiful together, that love could transcend the boundaries their peoples had set. Spring came eventually, as it always does, melting the snow and coaxing new growth from the frozen earth. Graka's pregnancy progressed normally, and Kieran fussed over her constantly until she threatened to ban him from the shelter if he did not stop treating her like she was made of glass. They prepared for the baby's arrival with the same determination they brought to everything else, building a cradle, gathering soft furs for swaddling, learning everything they could from Graka's memories of her mother's teachings. In early summer, as the valley bloomed with wildflowers and the days stretched long and golden, Graka went into labor. It was a difficult birth that lasted through the night and into the next morning, and there were moments when Kieran feared he would lose her. But Graka was strong, stronger than anyone he had ever known, and when dawn broke she delivered a healthy baby boy who announced his arrival with lusty cries that echoed through the valley. "He is perfect," Kieran breathed, holding his son for the first time with trembling hands. The baby had green-tinted skin lighter than Graka's but darker than his own, tiny ears that came to subtle points, and eyes that would probably settle to amber as he grew. He was unmistakably both human and orc, a living bridge between 2 worlds. "What should we call him?" Graka asked, exhausted but radiant. They had discussed names during the long winter but had not decided definitively. Now, looking at their son, Kieran knew. Kale Jamison Stonefist, a new name for a new life. "Kale," Graka repeated, testing the sound. "Yes, it is perfect." The months that followed were the happiest of Kieran's life. Watching Kale grow, seeing his son's personality emerge, teaching him about the world alongside Graka, these simple daily moments felt more valuable than anything he had experienced before. They were a family, unconventional and hidden from the world, but whole and happy. When Kale was nearly a year old, Graka spotted smoke rising from the ridge to the east of their valley. They watched it carefully for several days, and eventually Graka went to investigate, leaving Kieran with strict instructions to stay hidden with Kale if anyone approached while she was gone. She returned 2 days later with unexpected news. There is an orc settlement on the other side of that ridge. Small, maybe 20 families. I spoke with their scouts and explained our situation. They are willing to trade with us and they have agreed to keep our location secret. That is incredible, Kieran said, bouncing Kale on his hip. Does this mean we are not alone anymore? It means we have allies, at least. The clan leader is an older woman named Murga Ironheart. She lost her own mate to human violence years ago, so she understands the difficulty of our situation. She said that times are changing, that more orcs and humans are questioning the old hatreds. She believes that children like Kale are the future, and she wants to help protect that future. It was the beginning of something new. Over the following years, they developed a careful relationship with the nearby orc clan. Kale grew up knowing both his parents' cultures, learning orc traditions from Graka and the clan members who occasionally visited, learning human knowledge from Kieran. They had 2 more children, a daughter they named Kira, who had Kieran's lighter coloring but Graka's tusks and strength, and another son named Corvin, who looked almost fully human except for his pointed ears and unusually robust build. The children brought joy and purpose to the valley, and Kieran and Graka slowly built a life that was richer than either had imagined possible. They were not without challenges. There were lean winters and difficult seasons, times when old prejudices from the nearby clan created tension, moments when they feared discovery by human authorities. But they faced everything together, and their bond only grew stronger. One autumn afternoon, nearly 10 years after the ambush that had brought them together, Kieran and Graka sat on the hillside above their valley watching their children play by the stream below. Kale was teaching his younger siblings how to fish, demonstrating the patience and gentleness that made Kieran's heart swell with pride. "You ever wonder what would have happened if you had not saved me that day?" Kieran asked, lacing his fingers through Graka's. "I try not to," Graka admitted. "That path leads to darkness. You would have died and I would have continued my lonely existence, never knowing what I was missing." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I prefer to focus on what is, not what might have been." "What is pretty wonderful," Kieran agreed. "Terrifying and uncertain sometimes, but wonderful." "Do you regret staying, giving up your old life?" Kieran turned to look at her, this remarkable woman who had given him everything that mattered. "Not for a single moment. You are my life now. You and our children, this valley, the future we are building together. Everything else is just background noise." Graka smiled, the expression transforming her face with its radiance. "You always know exactly what to say. Years of practice." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun paint the valley in shades of gold and amber. Kale's laughter drifted up to them as he helped Kira land a fish, and Corvin splashed in the shallows with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. It was a perfect moment, the kind that Kieran tried to memorize because he knew how precious and fragile peace could be. As the sun touched the western ridge and the light began to fade, they gathered their children and headed back to the shelter for dinner. The walk down the hillside was filled with the usual chaos of children sharing their day, arguing over who caught the biggest fish, planning tomorrow's adventures. Graka caught Kieran's eye over their heads and smiled, and he knew she was thinking the same thing he was, that they were incredibly lucky, that they had built something precious and rare, that every day together was a gift. That night, after the children were asleep and the shelter was quiet, Kieran pulled Graka close and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" for dragging me to safety, for saving my life, for giving me a reason to live instead of just survive. For this family, this home, this love, for everything. Graka kissed him softly. I should be thanking you. You saw past what I was supposed to be and loved who I actually am. You gave me back my life when I thought it was over. You made me whole again. We made each other whole, Kieran corrected. Two broken people who found each other and built something beautiful from the pieces. Yes, Graka agreed. That is exactly what we did. They held each other in the darkness, listening to their children's peaceful breathing, feeling the warmth of the life they had built together. The world outside their valley remained complicated and often hostile, full of prejudice and conflict and fear. But here, in this small corner of the wilderness, love had won. Two people who should have been enemies had instead become partners, lovers, parents, a family. Years passed in the valley, marked by the changing seasons and the growth of their children. Kale grew into a young man with his mother's strength and his father's gentleness, determined to bridge the gap between humans and orcs. Kira became a skilled healer, learning plant lore from both traditions and developing medicines that combined the best of both. Corvin showed an aptitude for building and crafting, creating beautiful objects that blended human techniques with orc designs. Eventually, word of their unique family began to spread beyond the immediate area. Some reacted with hostility, but others were curious, even hopeful. A few other mixed couples emerged from hiding, encouraged by the example Kieran and Graka had set. Slowly, painfully slowly, attitudes began to shift in some corners of the frontier territories. Kieran and Graka watched these changes with cautious optimism, never forgetting that progress was fragile and could reverse at any time. But they also allowed themselves to hope that perhaps their children would live in a world more accepting than the one they had inherited, that Kale and Kira and Corvin would not have to hide who they were. On their 20th anniversary of the day they had bonded in the sacred grove, Kieran and Graka returned to that spot alone, leaving their children in the care of friends from the nearby clan. The ancient pines stood unchanged, eternal and patient, and the clearing beneath them was dappled with the same golden light that had blessed their union 2 decades earlier. 20 years, Graka marveled, running her hand along the rough bark of one of the trees. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you were a wounded human I should have left to die. Other times it feels like I have known you forever. Both can be true, Kieran said, wrapping his arms around her from behind. Time is funny that way. If you could go back to that moment in the ravine, knowing everything that would come after, would you still make the same choice? To let you save me? Absolutely. Every hardship we have faced has been worth it for what we have together. What about you? Would you still drag me a mile to safety? Graka turned in his arms to face him, her amber eyes bright with love. In a heartbeat. Saving you was the best decision I ever made, even though I did not know it at the time. You have given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. We gave each other that life, Kieran corrected gently, a callback to a conversation they had held many times over the years. Neither of us could have done it alone. Together, Graka agreed, pressing her forehead to his. Always together. They renewed their vows under the ancient pines, the words different now with 20 years of lived experience behind them, but the commitment just as deep. They spoke of the children they had raised, the community they had slowly built, the future they still hoped to see. They spoke of love that had grown and changed and deepened with time, becoming something richer and more complex than the desperate passion of their early days. As the sun set and the first stars emerged overhead, they walked hand in hand back to their valley, back to the home and family they had built, back to the life they had fought so hard to create and defend. The path was familiar now, worn smooth by 2 decades of footsteps, and they walked it in comfortable silence. Smoke rose from the chimney of their shelter as they approached, and they could hear the sounds of their children preparing dinner, probably arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to do which task. It was ordinary and domestic and absolutely perfect, everything Kieran had never known he wanted, and everything Graka had thought she had lost forever. "We did good," Kieran said softly as they paused at the edge of their clearing. "We did," Graka agreed. "Against all odds, against all expectations, we built something lasting and true." They stood together for a moment longer, taking in the sight of their home lit from within by firelight, the sound of their children's laughter, the peace of the valley settling around them like a blessing. Then together, they stepped forward into the warmth and light, into the family they had created, into the future they were still building one day at a time. The ambush had come from both sides and he had gone down hard, but the orc girl had dragged him to safety. That single act of compassion had changed everything, had set in motion a chain of events that transformed 2 lonely outcasts into partners, into lovers, into a family. It had proven that love could transcend hatred, that understanding could overcome prejudice, that 2 people willing to fight for each other could create something beautiful in a world that said they should not exist. Their story was far from over, but this chapter had a happy ending. Kieran and Graka had found in each other what they had both been missing: acceptance, love, home, and hope. They had built a life together from nothing, had raised children who embodied the best of both their peoples, had shown by example that a different future was possible. And every morning when they woke beside each other, they remembered that day in the forest when everything had changed, when an orc woman had made the choice to save a dying human instead of walking away. It was the moment their real lives had begun, the moment they had started down the path that led to this perfect, improbable, hard-won happiness. Together they had faced every challenge and overcome every obstacle, and together they would face whatever came next, building their future one shared moment at a time in the quiet valley they called home.